This podcast series is full of difficult and troubling content from the start. Please take care while listening. For our seventh and final episode, we go back to 1990 and tell the story of, in the words of the Crown Star expert witness, Dr. Dewi Evans, one of the worst cover-ups in NHS history. A tragedy of the death of a boy who should have lived, but was let down by doctors who were grossly negligent and who then tried to hide their mistakes by forgery. Not forgetting Dr. Evans's own role in that cover-up. Here's the father of the dead boy, Will Powell.
Doesn't stack up to me, and he should never have done it, in my view. And by doing it, he did assist the doctors who weren't prosecuted. And we know from the Crown Prosecution Service in 2003 that there was enough evidence to charge some of these doctors for forgery and attempting to pervert the course of justice. In my view, Dr. Dewi Evans, when he knew of Robbie's death, could have had an investigation into his department. He chose not to do that. He had the medical records again in 1995 after reading an article in The Guardian, which was damning, showing that these doctors had lied and falsified records. And yet he still wrote a letter supporting the doctors. I think it's absolutely scandalous.
But first, we identify the doctor at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, who, experts now believed, accidentally killed a baby, a death blamed on Lucy Letby. You are listening to The Trials of Lucy Letby. Was there ever a crime? Episode 7, Unreliable Witness. With me, Edward Abel Smith.
And me, John Sweeney. A few days ago, Lucy Letby's new defence lawyer, Mark MacDonald, held a press conference to launch a campaign appealing against her convictions because the evidence against her is unsafe. Narrowing in on just one case, Dr. Richard Taylor, a neonatologist, told reporters that he believed that baby O had not been murdered by Lucy Letby.
The baby had an apnea, and the medical staff, an apnea is a pause in breathing, and the medical staff responded to this by intubating the baby, placing the baby onto a ventilator, and the baby was not unwell particularly, but it had an apnea, but they placed the baby on a ventilator and then put the baby on very high pressure settings. So in neonatology, when we ventilate babies, we ventilate by pressure rather than by lung volume. And this baby was placed on very high pressure settings, inappropriate for the fact that the baby actually had no lung disease at all. So the baby was being ventilated on very high pressure settings. Again, the nurses were concerned that the medical staff had actually left the unit. They then came back. Things didn't look quite right. And to summarize what happened, the nurse was again concerned that the abdomen was distended, and one of the doctors responded to this by placing a needle into the abdomen. So they directly aspirated the abdomen, and they chose to use a point which in medical parlance is called McBurney's point. This is a description of the point that is used for performing an appendectomy. The baby did not need an appendectomy. This is a newborn. Appendectomy is completely irrelevant to it. If an aspirate was going to be attempted, it should have been done on the left side, but in fact the doctor used McBurney's point, which is on the right side. As I have already said, the baby was on very high pressure settings, and this is confirmed by an X-ray of both the abdomen and the chest. And the settings were so high that the baby's liver was pushed right down into the pelvis. So when the doctor performed the aspiration of the abdomen, the needle perforated the liver. The baby was still being ventilated with a needle in the liver. The liver was now being lacerated by the needle. And this led to bleeding, free blood going into the abdomen. The baby went into shock. The shock was actually confirmed by a subsequent blood test, which showed that the baby's hemoglobin had halved, and they were unable to resuscitate the baby, partly because they didn't realize what they'd done.
What was the name of the doctor?
I don't think it's right that we name names at this stage.
I think the doctor knows who they are.
We don't.
I know. I have to say, from a personal point of view, that if this had happened to me, I'd be unable to sleep at night, knowing that what I had done had led to the death of the baby, and now there is a nurse in jail convicted of murder.
Having looked at the evidence, how strong do you think the evidence against Lucy Letby is compared to your theory? That, as I understand it, the doctor accidentally killed the baby by mistake.
The claim was that I think that Lucy Letby had injected air into the baby. I'm not even sure what the prosecution was claiming, but it's nonsense. Complete nonsense. The baby died from shock, from a liver perforation.
We've established from trial evidence that the doctor who put the needle into Baby O's liver was the head of the unit, Dr. Stephen Breary. We wrote to him asking for comment, but he made no reply. To recap, 4 doctors accused Lucy Letby of being a serial killer. Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. John Gibbs, Dr. Ravi Jairam, and a doctor known only as Dr. B. A year before Lucy Letby supposedly started on her murder spree, Dr. B accidentally killed a baby by placing a breathing tube down the esophagus, not the trachea, and ignoring 5 warning signs pointing to their mistake. It is common ground that Dr. John Gibbs forgot to switch a baby monitor back on, and that Dr. Jairam wanted to be a TV star. And now, Dr. Breary is being accused by experts in his own field of also accidentally killing a baby.
At the press conference, Mark MacDonald explained that he was going to take the whole case back to the Court of Appeal because Dr. Dewi Evans had changed his mind about how the nurse had supposedly murdered baby C. Summarising Dr. Evans's evidence, Nicholas Johnson, KC for the Crown, told the jury in his closing speech in June 2023, "When you put baby C's case alongside the others, it's as plain as the nose on your face that Lucy Letby must have injected air down the nasogastric tube into baby C's stomach. It was, after all, one of her favourite ways of killing."
But later, it came out that Lucy Letby wasn't on shift then. Cheshire Police had got her swipe card details the wrong way round, thinking her on when she was off. After that, Dr. Evans changed his mind. He wrote to Channel 5 on August the 3rd this year saying, "None of the babies were killed as a direct result of the injection of air or fluid and air deliberately injected into their stomachs."
So Mark MacDonald is raising big questions about the reliability of Dr. Dewi Evans as a witness, and so do we, for his role in a scandal that started 34 years ago. Remember our interview with Dr. Evans from episode 4. Dr. Evans is the Welsh former paediatrician who knocked on the door of Cheshire Police and went through the medical notes and absolved the doctors at the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital and pointed the finger again and again and again at serial killer Nurse Lucy Letby. Listen to this. So is it possible that this is a badly run unit and there is a sewage problem, and the sewage means that there is killer bacteria in the taps? They found Pseudomonas in 2 taps in the unit. They didn't know about the raw sewage in the unit. They didn't know about the killer bacteria.
And none of us knew about that, as far as I know.
Yes, but it's interesting, though, isn't it? Isn't it noteworthy? I mean, we asked one former neonatal doctor, paediatrician, neonatal experience, how many units he'd worked on where there'd been raw sewage. And he said, never.
Never. I mean,
was it in your unit?
Good God, no.
At Swansea?
Good God, no.
Would you, if there was a raw sewage leak, what would you have done?
It would have been sorted.
How quickly?
We would have closed the unit down. We would have demanded that the management sort out the problem, sort the plumbing out, and would not admit any babies until it was dealt with.
But why didn't they do that? But why didn't they do that at the Countess of Chester Hospital?
I think the management was incompetent.
One of our listeners is Will Powell from Ystrad near Swansea, whose son died of a treatable illness that was not properly picked up. Hearing Dr. Evans tell us that if he had a problem at his hospital, he would have acted swiftly to deal with it, struck a chord with him, but not in a good way.
It's the fact that Dr. Evans knew the day after Robbie died that a 10-year-old child had died in his department. According to him, he didn't make inquiries as to why Robbie died. Had he done so, he would have known that Robbie had died as a consequence of the failures or the gross failures of his department. Then there would have been, according to him, in relation to other cases, like for argument's sake, there was sewage in the sinks at the neonatal unit that he said had happened in his department, he would have closed it down, which indicates that he had a lot of power in relation to what went on in the department. And had he had an investigation into Robbie's death, that I believe he should have done, I wouldn't be talking to you today, 34 years after my son's death, attempting to prove that not only were these doctors grossly negligent, they lied and falsified our son's medical records and publicly called my wife and I liars.
What happened to Robbie Powell all those years ago is a tragedy, but one that has implications for the safety of the murder convictions against supposed serial killer nurse Lucy Letby.
The Crown's case against Lucy Letby hangs on his interpretation of complex medical issues. And now a series of experts are asking big questions about how and why Dr. Evans came to his conclusions. But no one covering the Lucy Letby case has ever questioned Dr. Evans' competence as a paediatrician.
Until that is now. In December 1989, Dr. Dewi Evans was one of the 3 senior children's doctors, paediatric consultants in the jargon, at Morriston's Hospital in Swansea. That month, Robbie Powell from the Swansea area, then aged 9, fell ill and was admitted to hospital. Robbie was below weight, had pain in his abdomen, was throwing up, but weirdly had no diarrhea. And he had another very unusual symptom.
Up until April of 1990, Robbie appeared well, although he had pigmentation of his skin, which we didn't realise was relevant to the underlying condition.
Sorry to interrupt. Pigmentation of the skin, how did that show itself?
Darkening of the skin. It looked like his elbows, these fingers, he hadn't washed. He had a black man's willy, which he said in the bath, look, Dad, I've got a BMW, a black man's willy. And his genitals were black.
No offence intended, but please note that's not a difficult symptom to spot. Note 5 symptoms: excessive weight loss, vomiting but no diarrhea, abdominal pain, darkening of the skin. The doctors suspected that he had a common tummy bug, but that would not explain the absence of diarrhea, still less the weird pigmentation of the skin.
These are key symptoms of Addison's disease. Addison's, caused by failure in the adrenal glands, which sit directly above the kidneys, to create the hormone cortisone, is fatal if not treated. Its most famous sufferer was JFK, whose assassination showed that if the disease is spotted and managed properly, sufferers from Addison's can enjoy a full life.
Did Dr. Dewi Evans and his colleagues work out that Robbie had Addison's disease? Tests showed that Robbie was low on sodium, low blood sugar, high potassium, classical chemical symptoms of Addison's, along with the telltale abdominal pain, weight loss, vomiting, no diarrhea, and darkened skin.
Robbie was primarily seen by one of Dr. Evans's colleagues, Dr. William Forbes. The consultant, who is now dead, instructed the following info to be sent to Robbie's GPs. Addison's disease was suspected. Robbie needed an ACTH test for Addison's disease. Robbie suffered from hormonal imbalance. Robbie's parents had been so informed. Robbie was sent home, but the hospital did not weigh him on discharge. A schoolboy error. Dr. Forbes asked the GPs that they should send Robbie back to hospital immediately if he became ill again. The test never took place. Mum and Dad were not told about Addison's disease or the need for the test. But Robbie was suffering from extreme symptoms of the disease and Addisonian crisis. The normal treatment is hypercortisone. However, according to the medical records, this was never given.
Robbie had lost a third of his body weight while he was in hospital. Back home, a photo taken on Boxing Day shows him looking like a skeleton. In January 1990, Robbie returned to the hospital. His weight was up, so Dr. Forbes went with a tummy bug diagnosis and cancelled the ACTH test. Through a chapter of accidents, neither Dad Will Powell nor Mum Diane learnt about the provisional diagnosis of Addison's disease. But it was in the medical notes sent to the GPs.
Did Robbie receive correct treatment from Morrison's Hospital? Down the track, Dyfed Powers Police asked Addison's expert, Professor Charles Brooke, of Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London, to report. Professor Brooke wrote, "Since we do not know Robert's discharge weight from hospital on the 9th of December, Dr. Forbes was not entitled to be satisfied at a weight gain of almost a stone. The patient was not properly investigated, and the investigations that were available were not competently interpreted or acted upon."
In April 1990, Robbie fell ill again. In the last 15 days of his life, Will Powell begged GPs at the local medical centre to send Robbie back to hospital 6 times to no avail. This is what happened on the 7th attempt.
Robert started complaining of abdominal pain. So I phoned the GP, and the same GP came out. She refused to admit Robbie to hospital, saying there was no need. I argued with her that there was need, and that both my wife and I were in a hell of a state in relation to worry about Robbie's health. She said, "Okay, to put your wife's mind at rest, I'll admit him." So I went upstairs, got Robbie ready, thinking now that she would call an ambulance. Come downstairs, by which time she was writing out a referral letter, which I knew I needed because the hospital had told me before I could go to Ward 7. And I said, "Have you ordered an ambulance?" And she threw the referral letter at me and said, "No, take him by car." And she stormed out the house. Sorry, this is difficult. I put Robbie in my car, carried him from his bed into the back of the car. He was sucking his thumb. He was unknown to me. I thought he was falling asleep, but he was actually in and out of consciousness. The hospital was 12 miles away. It took us approximately 30 minutes to get there. I carried Robbie into Ward 7. I was told to place him in a bed in an examination room. I looked at Robbie, and his eyes were in the back of his head, and he wasn't breathing. I shouted, "Robbie, Robbie," and I was told to leave the room.
The hospital nurses and doctors found him in, quotes, a collapsed state, could not find a pulse, sunken eyes, airway problem, desperately ill, unresponsive, eyes fixed and staring, shallow breathing, dry lips, no resistance to intubation, seriously ill child, unconscious, horrific appearance, close to death, most seriously ill child admitted.
At Robbie's inquest in 2004, Dr. Narendra Agwal, one of the 3 consultant paediatricians, along with Dewi Evans and William Forbes, said under oath that he believed that Robbie was dead on arrival. Whether he was right or Robbie died later that night, the serial failure of the GPs to admit the boy to hospital was a terrible mistake.
In his report, Professor Brooke noted for this final admission that Robbie's sodium, potassium and blood sugar levels in the hospital notes were absolutely characteristic of Addison's disease, but that the doctors did not give hydrocortisone until too late. The outcome at 10 p.m., he wrote, was, alas, inevitable. Professor Brooke from Great Ormond Street concluded, although Addison's disease is not common, it is clear that the diagnosis was entertained in December 1989 and January 1990. Not to have pursued it constitutes practice of an unacceptably low standard. Had the diagnosis been made, Robert Powell would not have had a further collapse in April, and he would be alive to this day.
1 month after Professor Brooke wrote his report, the local health authority in May 1996 admitted responsibility, saying that had Robert received the optimum level of care in December 1989, January 1990, which regrettably he did not, it is likely that a diagnosis of Addison's disease would have been made. The authority considers that no individual clinician was to blame. At that time, the services were such that there were only 3 dedicated paediatric consultants who, with junior doctors, were coping with a massive caseload.
Now, there are 3 consultants in the hospital, Morriston's Hospital, at that time. Who is the lead on endocrinology, which is the liver and the kidneys, which is this area? Who's the lead doctor?
Dr. Dewi Evans. He was the expert in endocrinology.
Did he treat Robbie?
According to him, he did not, but his name is on fluid charts in Robert's hospital records.
And this is, I've seen these charts and they cover the date. It's a chart where it's a saline drip into Robbie when he's in hospital in December 1989, and it's for the 5th and the 6th and the 7th of December 1989. And he, and the name of the consultant is?
Dr. D. Evans was on top of the sheet.
Dr. Dewi Evans was one of the 3 paediatric consultants referred to in the health authority letter. They never faced the prospect of criminal prosecution. But did the jurors who convicted Lucy Letby know that the Crown Star expert witness was one of 3 senior hospital doctors whose health authority admitted liability to the wholly unnecessary death of a child? No, they did not. Did the juries hear the bigger picture, that the NHS often fails its patients and they often die? So you don't have to hunt for serial killers inside a crumbling British institution that kills people all the time by mistake. No, they did not.
We put this to Dr. Dewi Evans. His statement is read by an actor.
I'm afraid Will Powell was the victim of one of the worst cover-ups in NHS history. I had no involvement in Robbie's care. Will Powell showed me the D. Evans entry, but I was most certainly not involved and have no idea how it got there. We were a busy department, with 3 of us covering the whole of Swansea and surrounds, population 350,000. Bill Forbes retired and died some years later. He never mentioned Robbie's case with me ever, and we did not maintain social contact after his retirement. No one else discussed this case with me.
What did Will Powell make of this?
Well, I was a motor mechanic by trade, and I was a senior mechanic in the garage I worked, and I was a foreman. And obviously I was involved in running the garage. And on occasion, things would go wrong. And I'd have to know about that and have to look into it and have to make sure that those things, if it was our fault, never happened again. Also, we had to send cars to the specialist garage to have them repaired because we couldn't do it. I'd be the first in the forecourt finding out exactly what went wrong. that's how you learn things.
Do you find it weird that a child dies of a treatable disease, and Dewi Evans, who seems to be endlessly curious about other cases, for example, the Lucy Letby case, he knocked on the door of Cheshire Police, but about this case, he knows nothing, and no one ever spoke to him about it, as he says?
Well, I think it's inconceivable that being one of 3 consultant paediatricians, that he didn't know more about what happened to Robbie, even if it was after he died.
Inconceivable.
Inconceivable, in my view. He would want to have known, surely, how many children actually die in his department. Was it a regular thing? I don't think it was. And you have to distinguish between children that die from terminal illnesses. Tragically, that happens. But I don't think it happens very often that a child without a terminal illness and is expected to die, dies when he arrives at that hospital after being seen by 5 GPs 7 times.
But this is not the end of the story.
Why did you get in touch with me?
Well, when I made a complaint to the General Medical Council, I'd formally requested that they provide me with all the documents that they had been provided with from Dyfed-Powys Police. And amongst those documents was the letter that Dr. Dewi Evans, dated the 29th of March 1996, had actually sent to Dr. Keith Hughes. That formed part of the police files.
Why did you get in touch with me?
I get in touch with you just to inform you that Dr. Dewi Evans was a paediatrician, or one of 3 paediatricians at Morrison Hospital when Robbie died. And I felt uncomfortable that he'd supported GPs when he knew from a Guardian article in December 1994 and from Robert's hospital records, which he had in 1995, that these GPs had not only failed Robbie, but they'd falsified the child's medical records.
Okay, that's a big charge. Explain to me what happened when you say that they falsified the medical records. What did they do?
Well, following Robbie's death, Dr. Keith Hughes came to our home to discuss the post-mortem finding, which was Addison's disease had caused Robbie's death. I asked Dr. Keith Hughes to see the medical records, and in it, I read a document, information needs ACTH test, parents informed. Well, I said, what the effing hell is this letter and this test? And he said it was a hospital test. I then read on, and in the letter, it made it perfectly clear that Addison's disease had been suspected. And I said to Dr. Keith Hughes in a loud voice that my family heard, because I was in the front room with him on my own. I said, the effing hell suspected Robbie had Addison's disease. Why did you do nothing about it? Or words to that effect. So I knew 3 things from those GP records. 1, that Addison's disease had been suspected. 2, that Robert needed an ACTH test, and it was falsely claimed that the parents had been told when we hadn't been. And it was clear instructions for the GPs to get Robbie back to hospital if he became unwell.
What happened? You say that the medical records were falsified. Why do you say that?
Well, just to inform you that 3 days after I witnessed the medical records, I asked the Reverend Thomas, who was a neighbour, to witness what I had read and to contemporaneously record what was in the notes, because I couldn't believe what I'd read, and that Robbie was now dead when I now knew through medical books that Addison's was treatable. And the Reverend came to my home. He saw Robert's GP notes 6 days after the child died. the Addison's letter. Now, that letter, when I received the medical records, was not in the GP records. It'd been taken out.
When did you finally see all of the medical records?
Right. Well, I saw them. I first requested copies of them because I'd complained about the GPs, but I was refused copies, both of the hospital and the GP notes. I also, after receiving the GP notes and the copies on the 22nd of November 1990, the following day, I compared the photocopies with the original records. The Addison's letter had been removed. I had contacted the Family Health Services Authority that had provided the hospital records and the GP records, and I told them the documents were missing. I also did the same with Dr. Forbes' secretary, and those letters are a matter of record. So on the very day that I received copies of Robert's GP and hospital records, I immediately knew the Addison's letter had been removed.
Right, so give me a sense of the time gap. You see Robbie dies in April 1990. When do you see the medical records?
I see the GP medical records 3 days after Robbie's death.
Gosh. So the notes they've mucked around with the medical records to take out the damning diagnosis of Addison's. Have you ever been able to see these missing letters? Have you now got a copy so you can show me?
No, I haven't, because in 1990, we didn't have mobile phones. I didn't have a computer. I didn't have a scanner. And I had really no means of actually copying those letters.
The Addison's diagnosis had been on a letter typed on the back of Robbie's clinical summary sheet. At the GP surgery, that letter and the diagnosis was removed and substituted with a new clinical summary sheet, neither signed nor dated. This was, if you like, the first forgery. The second forgery was a letter from GP Dr. Mike Williams, typed after death, that backdated to when Robbie was alive, seeking to clear him of not referring Robbie back to hospital. The third forgery was Dr. Flower's consultation notes, again written after death. In the words of the CPS, the obvious purpose was to mislead any inquiry into thinking that they had been written contemporaneously, and there is therefore an evidential basis for prosecuting her for an offence of forgery. To recap, Robbie Powell had the classic symptoms of Addison's disease, which is a killer if left untreated. The GPs were sent the notes suspecting Addison's disease, but they didn't act on it. Far from it. After Robbie died, the medical notes were doctored.
Will Powell suffered post-traumatic stress disorder and gave up his job as a plasterer, but campaigned for justice, making programmes with ITV's Wales This Week. In 1992, a notice went up in the GP's practice, calling Mr. Powell's comments, quotes, lies, a distortion of the facts, and some belonged in the realms of fantasy. The Powells sued for libel and won. Separately, the Powells took a civil case about the negligence that led to Robbie's death and the faking of the medical records, all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. The court found that doctors had, post-death, no legal duty to tell the parents the truth about Robbie's negligent treatment and the falsification of the medical records. The case was dismissed.
And what about the criminal law? In 1994, he asked the police to investigate the GPs for forgery and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. A second expert endocrinologist, Professor Lewin Hughes of Cambridge University, was asked to look at the 5 GPs who had treated Robbie Powell. Professor Hughes concluded that one, Dr. Elwyn Hughes, no relation, had behaved in a contempt fashion, but 4 GPs were grossly negligent. Separately, Detective Inspector Bob Poole for Operation Radiance put forward 35 suggested criminal charges against 5 GPs: Dr. Elwyn Hughes, Dr. Nicola Flower, Dr. Michael Williams, Dr. Paul Boldaz, Dr. Keith Hughes, and their medical secretary, Linda Sims. Charges included forgery, attempting to pervert the course of justice, and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. However, the CPS never pressed charges on negligence, nor forgery, nor conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The CPS apologised for its failures in the tragedy this year.
But long before the reports by Professor Hughes and the Detective Chief Inspector, another doctor had written a letter absolving the GPs, saying that it was understandable that they had missed Addison's disease. There may well have been other factors, but the practical effect was that Dyfed-Powys Police never prosecuted the GPs for negligence or forgery. The doctor who absolved the GPs wrote,
"One can but conclude that there are conditions in children that are virtually undiagnosable before it is too late. Certainly, I cannot think of any steps that you could have taken as the GPs which could have anticipated such an event."
The doctor who wrote that letter was Dewi Evans. Do you think this letter from Dewi Evans is a whitewash?
I think it is, but I've based that on the fact that when a professor of endocrinology looked at the events in relation to the GP's involvement in Robbie's care in the 15 days prior to his death, he opined that 4 of the 5 GPs were medically grossly negligent and a substantial cause of Robbie's death. How can Dr. Dewi Evans or any other doctor think that the conduct of those GPs was acceptable?
The Lucy Letby trial, what they thought they heard from Dr. Evans was this was a good doctor who knows his stuff. He's retired, but he knew his stuff as a paediatrician. But when he says in his letter, to the GPs, I can't think of any steps you could have taken as a general practitioners which could have anticipated such an event. Well, what about the note about the Addison's disease? What about the removal of the note of the Addison's disease, the falsification of the medical records? It feels like that when it comes down to it, he favours doctors over ordinary people.
I think he does that when it suits him.
That, to me, does not point to a reliable witness.
Well, I'd have to agree with you.
Dr. Dewi Evans told us in a statement,
"The GPs clearly failed him, not because they did not suspect Addison's, but because they failed to appreciate he was so seriously ill. I think his parents called them out 3 or 4 times over Easter weekend. This explains the content of my letter written on behalf of the GPs. I knew them well, carried out regular clinics at Ystrad Community Hospital, and in my opinion, the overall quality of their practice was very good, notwithstanding Robbie's tragedy. I was never involved in any investigation, but Will Powell's comments, re-altered notes, etc. are probably correct. The way Will Powell was treated by NHS management and the Old Welsh office was quite frankly appalling. As with all the events, I was not involved, kept in the dark, and did not have access to any disclosures. Having admitted liability for both GPs and hospital doctors, the clinical negligence issues are legally closed. It's up to the police and CPS to decide if the alleged forgeries met the criteria for a criminal charge. They decided it did not. Although my meetings with Mr. Powell were always courteous, I just could not and cannot see what more I can do. I was unable to persuade the politicians to initiate an inquiry, not in the public interest and all that. I don't see this changing anytime soon. I feel terribly sorry for Will Powell.
We shared Dr. Evans' statement with Will Powell, and he told us,
But what he did was inappropriate. He should never have written to those GPs who he knew. And he also knew from the media and from the hospital records that they'd been falsified and that these GPs had failed Robbie's in relation to his medical care. So it was inappropriate of him to have written that letter supporting doctors who he knew were responsible for the death of my son. And to tell me that he was familiar with them professionally just adds insult to injury. Writing such a letter.
You didn't know about it when he wrote it. You only found out about it later. When you read the letter later on, how did you feel?
I felt let down. I felt that his letter had influenced Dyfed-Powys Police not to appoint a medical expert because he was in fact clearing them for any wrongdoing. And that again influenced the police not to get their own independent expert.
Do you think he's a reliable witness that the courts can trust? So I'm thinking now about the Lucy Letby case, because he was the star expert witness in that case. From your own experience, do you think he's a reliable witness?
Well, he certainly wasn't a reliable witness when it came to Robbie's case, because he suppressed information that he was aware of.
Do you think the conviction against Lucy Letby is safe?
I can't comment on the conviction or the evidence. What I will say through my 34 years experience with the NHS, that she did not have a fair trial. And whether she's guilty or not, she deserves to have a fair trial in the name of justice.
Lucy Letby remains in prison, serving 15 whole life terms for murder and attempted murder. She has always pleaded innocent.
This is our last episode, but our crowdfunder to pay for our legal and production costs remains open. If you're able to support us, the link to the crowdfunder is on our social media feed.
If you have any information you think could be useful to us in the future, please email us on lucyletby@gmail.com.
The Trials of Lucy Letby Was There Ever a Crime? Was investigated, presented and produced by me, John Sweeney, and Edward Abel Smith. This is a Chalk and Blade production, co-produced by Jason Phipps and Ruth Barnes. Ross Ramsey Golding is the editor. Legal services were provided by Sarah Vandor Mackay at Reviewed and Cleared. Research and reporting by Cleucida Oliveira and Anouk Curry. Sound from the press conference by Guy Rowland.